want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, and welcome back to the Enemies List. I'm your host, Rick Wilson. Today, I am delighted to be joined by David Brock. David is a guy who has been involved in the political and the media space for a long time. One of the folks who has helped bring Media Matters, American Bridge, Crew, a whole bunch of other stuff into playing a vital role in American elections. David and I have been on the opposite side of a lot of things sometimes, but we are together now in our belief that we've got a country to save on a lot of different fronts. David's written a valuable new book with a blunt and real title. It's called Stench: The Making of the Thomas Court and the Unmaking of America. This is a story about how Clarence Thomas has fundamentally shaped the Supreme Court that is today, now has brought us the Dobbs decision, presidential immunity, and a whole bunch of other things. And David's taken a deep dive into how Clarence Thomas has been sort of the linchpin of this corruption that's grown in the court. So, David, thank you so much for coming on the show today. And I want to start out and get your perspective. Like, what led you to write this book as Thomas became sort of the obvious center of gravity of the court in the last few years? We knew he was important. What was it that led you to write this book at this time?
Well, thanks for having me on. Basically, two things. Once the Dobbs decision came down, I knew that there was a story in there about essentially a 40-year campaign by the right to overturn Roe, and that I wanted to tell that story. This is before so the court was already in a legitimacy crisis because the decision was so unpopular for one reason. But and then the ethics crisis and all of the gifts to Clarence Thomas. I was already working on the book when that came out. My second reason was, though, that I had personal experience with the Thomas Hill hearings, and I think that the rot that is now kind of apparent to a lot of people at the court, you can trace it all back to that hearing and the perjury that Thomas committed at that time and got away with, and that it's been sitting there for all these years. And I think it's part of the story of the decay of the court. And then, of course, with the Dobbs decision, Roberts lost control of the court, and that's why I say the court tilts toward Thomas, because Roberts tried to negotiate a compromise in that decision unsuccessfully, and Thomas and Alito kind of hijacked things, and it went down the way it did.
So, you mentioned this thing that, and you and I both have our origins, back in the day on the right. You a little earlier than I did, but this was never a secret on the right. And I was shocked how many of my liberal friends, when Roe was overturned, they were so shocked. They were like, I can't believe this happened. I'm like, were you not paying attention for 40 years when they told you over and over and over again, we're going to stack the courts and overturn Roe? They did it. This was, as you said, this was a long-running, publicly announced, publicly facing plan that the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo and a whole constellation of other right-wing groups, evangelical groups, had pushed nonstop since Roe was decided by the court. I'm fascinated. Like, why is it, do you think, that so many people in America seemed surprised by the fact that there is a vast right-wing conspiracy? It really existed and has existed for a very long time.
That's a great question. So I think, Trump was the first presidential candidate to explicitly say he was going to appoint justices who were going to overturn Roe. Before that, a lot of people were playing games with their rhetoric, saying that there were no litmus tests for the judges. And I suppose that Democrats largely accepted that. The other thing is Democrats have never been organized around the voting on the courts. The evangelical right, going back to at least Reagan, when the platform explicitly said, let's overturn Roe, has been organized around this. And Democrats have never really, they really didn't have their eye on the ball. And it was, we did some focus groups in American Bridge after the decision leaked and before it was rendered, and people still were not believing that it was going to happen, even though the leak was in the public domain and it was clear that that's where we were going. So Democrats have been in denial on this issue, and it's to their detriment. And one of the things I'm trying to do with the book is to say to Democrats, independents, and even some Republicans, the Supreme Court is on the ballot this year. Thomas and Alito are in their mid and late 70s. It's clear that they want to, at least Thomas wants to retire if Trump is elected. And what we'll have is we'll have them replaced with judges in their 40s, and we'll be dug under another 2 generations of a radical court that's completely anti-majoritarian and contrary to what the American people want on a range of issues, not just abortion.
But people like Leonard Leo are not done here. I mean, Leonard Leo has $1 billion endowment now to play havoc and to keep this thing going if Republicans recapture power. And Trump had a degree of success in stacking the court, below the Supreme Court level as well. Now, to his credit, Biden has been very assertive on that front and had sort of offset some of that damage. But there's certainly been a great uniformity of Thomas-like judges being appointed. So you see that if they do recapture power, you're going to get Clarence Thomas's or more, or even further out on the ideological edge if you get Trump back part 2.
Yeah, absolutely. So the research I did for the book showed that 45% of the current federal appellate judiciary are members of the Federalist Society. And that Leonard Leo spent about $750 million over just the last 10 years to achieve these ends, to get these justices on the court and the campaigns to confirm them. And so, it is and it isn't a secret. The Federalist Society started as they built themselves as a debating society. They even at times eschewed the conservative label. And so there was a stealth aspect to all this. And of course, the money, the $750 million that I just mentioned, we really don't know mostly where that comes from. The Koch brothers are obviously involved. Rebecca Mercer, a Trump supporter. But we don't know, because of Citizens United, which of course Thomas was a critical part of, where all the money's coming from. So it was public, but yet again, there was a stealth aspect to it where it's understandable that people may have misread their intentions. But what I show in the book is that from the very first Federalist Society conference, the keynote speaker, Robert Bork, his speech was about overturning Roe. And so this wasn't, and that was covered in some local coverage at the time. So it wasn't a secret. But what's interesting now is that Leonard Leo is coming out more publicly about his real goals. And even just in the last few weeks, he gave an interview to the Financial Times where he said his goal is to crush liberalism. And so he's not done. And it's not just the courts. They want to get into media. They want to get into culture. They are terrorizing corporations that have diversity programs. So it's a whole range of things now. And he's got, pretty much unlimited money.
Right. A $1.6 billion endowment or something. So I want to get to the aspect of this that doesn't have to do with the jurisprudence part, but rather with Clarence Thomas in particular, becoming this ethical or a poster child for unethical court behavior. Talk to us about how Clarence Thomas's role in the court has basically enriched him. Talk to us about the sort of sugar daddies and supporters of Clarence Thomas, that that seem to have gotten a very a very good return on their investment.
Absolutely. It's really, when you consider it, it's a bargain. And Thomas is basically, not that he didn't have right-wing views to begin with, but
Sure.
he is a captive of these special interest donors, Harlan Crow being the main one, who has not business but ideological interest before the court. And it's all connected. Harlan Crow is a major funder of the Federalist Society. And so and of course, the Koch brothers do have business interests before the court, and they're directly doing this not out of any philanthropic desire, but out of their, to protect the bottom line of their companies. But these gifts are pretty extraordinary. I mean, no one's ever seen anything like it. And it has ranged, obviously, from very lavish trips to buying a very expensive RV. What's interesting about Thomas is he seems not to care about any attempt to hold him accountable. He seems not to care about the press coverage. Seems not to care about public opinion. I think he's still very angry about the Anita Hill hearings, and he feels like these are his enemies, and he's going to smite them. And he can act with a sense of impunity because he's there for life. And what we really need is, one of the things we need that I talk about in the book is an enforceable ethics regime for the Supreme Court. They made a nod in this direction after some of these really damaging stories of Thomas came out, but it's an unenforceable ethics code, and so it's up to them to decide what to disclose. It's up to them to decide when to recuse themselves from cases, and that has to change. And with a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president, I think it could change.
So explain to us, because this is something I fundamentally think you're absolutely correct on this, but I have had people say to me, oh, well, they can't do it because it's a separate branch of government. I'm like, no, Congress does have the ability to get the court in line with federal ethics standards, which all other judges have to play under as well. So talk to us a little bit about what that would look like and how Congress would accomplish that.
Yeah, well, Alito has said publicly that he thinks that Congress has no authority to do this. But most of legal opinion is the opposite, that Congress does have the authority to do this. There is also something, so Congress could take action, but you're going to need majorities in both houses to do it. You're probably going to need to break the filibuster in the Senate to get it through. One of the many things that you probably need to break the filibuster for to get any real progress on. The other way to do it is there is something called the Judicial Conference of the United States, which is a governing body for all the federal judges except the Supreme Court. And there's been discussions, I say in the book, there have been discussions at that body once the Thomas things came out and embarrassed everybody in the federal judiciary to take something up from that institution. But Roberts has stepped on it. And so Roberts is really not a good character here in terms of trying to bring any accountability to the court.
I wanted to ask you a question about Roberts because he clearly plays a big role in this. Roberts is very frequently described as a centrist, an institutionalist, a sort of more, bushy kind of Republican. But he seems to have, his ability to steer this plane does not seem to include any kind of left rudder on it. He seems to constantly sort of signal he wants something different, but goes along essentially. He's not really built another coalition on the court to overcome the Alito-Thomas axis, has he? I mean, I think that branding is successful for him, but I don't think it's a reality.
Yeah, no, I don't. And the stories over the weekend about how the presidential immunity case came down illustrates exactly what you're saying, which is to say that there were some opportunities to forge coalitions with some of the liberal justices, particularly Sonia Sotomayor, who wanted to have more votes rather than fewer votes on that. And he completely blew them off. and just went with the votes he had, which were enough votes. And I think that's a sign that, as I said, during Dobbs, he was losing control of the court. I think now he's reasserting himself and trying to outdo Thomas and Alito. And in this immunity case, which nobody expected, he just went with Trump.
Right, right. And the immunity case, to my mind, look, Dobbs was incredibly consequential and politically incredibly consequential. But I think the immunity case is the one that frightens me and scares me more for the potential abuse of power, and because of its breadth, and because of the fact that Thomas didn't stand up against it, or excuse me, Roberts didn't really hold the line against it at all. I don't think that's percolated through people's minds enough, like just how much of a realignment of federal power that really is.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And so, as I said, the story I tell is really focused on Roe, but there are a lot of other consequential decisions, this being one of them, that the MAGA court is shoving down our throats. They've got a supermajority of 6, and all 6 were members of the Federalist Society, they're gonna make up the law if they have to. There's a lot of talk about originalism on the right, but that was kind of the big idea of the Federalist Society. But they go against their principles. They go against the originalist principles when it serves a partisan interest. So it's sorry to say that we've got a lot of these justices are more politicians than they are judges at this point.
And there does seem to be an openness to being overtly more political now. I mean, we heard a couple of weeks ago in one of the Trump court hearings that they had been conferring with Clarence Thomas about using the immunity decision to help shield Trump from one of the election cases he had been involved in. And it strikes me that the court in the pre-Trump era, they were much more careful about seeming to interact with the political party, whichever one brought them to the dance. They seem to be much more about being an independent part of an independent branch of the government than a subsidiary of either Trump or the Republican Party. But that wall really does strike me as it's sort of coming down, and more quickly than anyone thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people will remember there was a time when Republican justices like Sandra Day O'Connor and Kennedy and Souter were independent. They sometimes disappointed some of the people who supported them and appointed them, but they rendered independent judgments, and that's part of the reason why Roe took them 40 plus years to overturn. But today, you've got pretty much a party line, mostly 6, certainly 5. Some people say Amy Coney Barrett is got a slight independent streak, but I think when it's going to count, she's going to vote her tribe.
That tribalism is something. I mean, yes, the Federalist Society is sort of weeding them out well in advance, so you're not going to get, I don't think, in the future, anybody who's particularly iconoclastic. Let's put it that way. But I do want to talk about go back to the corruption in the ethics code for a second. What does the corruption level look like beyond Thomas? He's gotten a lot of the coverage here, and he's gotten a lot of the attention. But this is not exclusively about Clarence Thomas either. There is a broader problem in the court right now of accepting these corporate and personal benefits from these folks like the Harlan Crows of the world.
Right. So with Thomas, it's almost a difference of kind than degree, because it's so egregious.
Mhm.
There is a case with Alito where a similar trip was paid for. It was once that we know of. So it doesn't really compare to what Thomas has done.
Right.
And I think that that is really that's really he's really the ethical crisis on the court. There are there are scattered instances of some other things, but really it's the scale of what Thomas did is hard to fathom.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's one of the things that people, no one wants Republican or Democrat, no one loves corruption, at any real level, but it's been hard for me to watch how much the Republicans have accommodated the idea of Thomas's corruption. It's sort of been greeted with like a nod and a wink, like, oh well, okay, you know, he's making the right decisions, so we're not going to say anything about it.
Yeah, I think that's right. As long as he's serving their interests and voting the right way, they've some quiet, some have been out there, even defending it.
Mhm.
He's got a core group of sort of defenders that he's had
Sure.
since the Anita Hill hearings that go out and peddle a bunch of BS about this, about how he really wasn't required to disclose these gifts, but that's wrong. And the
Right.
other issue he has is the refusal issues. So it's not just the gifts, but in the January 6th cases, for example.
That was my next question.
Yeah, I mean, so we're obviously people know about Ginny Thomas's emails to Mark Meadows, and that she was an insurrectionist. She was on the board of Center for National Policy, which was pushed to overturn the results of the election. She was a lobbyist against Obamacare when Thomas was sitting in that case. There are some egregious instances there where Thomas, on the basis of what is activities of his wife, has failed to recuse himself in a number of these cases. And again, that's the way they do it. Is it's up to the justice to make his own decision, and there's no filter on that at all.
It's just so striking to me because we have seen in the past justices recuse themselves for a variety of reasons from cases, but Thomas is now. I mean, this is such a bright line case that his own spouse is involved in the matter that he is going to consider before the court, and I can't think of any precedent that's even close to that with any other justice. Or frankly, I mean, I've seen federal judges recuse themselves because a second cousin was involved in a case, somebody they don't really know. But I mean, he's just the boldness of it and the starkness of the refusal. I think it's accelerated the crisis that the court has found itself in.
Yeah, and as I said, even in the sense of the gifts, I think with the recusal too, he basically just feels like he's sticking his thumb in the eye of his critics and the people who've been after him for since Anita Hill, and that's his fundamental attitude. And it's hard to figure out what to do about it, but there is something interesting, I think. We talked a lot about the imposing an ethics regime. The fact is that there are already laws on the books that Thomas is violating, and I get into this.
Sure.
The Ethics in Government Act from 1978 has disclosure requirements. There are laws about recusal. And so what Sheldon Whitehouse and Ron Wyden did in July, they wrote a letter to the Justice Department, basically a criminal referral of Thomas, saying special counsel should be appointed to look into this because he's already in violation of laws that are already on the books. And that probably will not go very far with Merrick Garland.
Right.
But if we got a tougher attorney general in there, that is one route that won't require Congress. And I think in the Thomas case, it's completely warranted. Because there are probably tax implications of these gifts.
What do you think?
doubt he
Yeah.
paid taxes on all this money. Yeah. So there's a lot to investigate. And I think, one route would be having the Justice Department do it.
You make an argument for impeaching Thomas in the book. Set aside for a second that the impeachment hill in the current Senate would be, the conviction would be impossible, I think, in the currently comprised Senate. Do you think that we would end up with do you think it would change the public understanding of this? I feel like in some ways the corruption of Thomas, and I'm glad you wrote the book because of this, has been sort of a Washington, D.C. parlor game story. It hasn't, I don't think, broken through to the wider public. Do you think that we would end up moving the ball on the ethical questions of Thomas if we went into a full impeachment in say the spring of 2025?
I absolutely do. As you said, we're not going to get a 2/3 conviction vote in the Senate, but I think that the House could shine a lot of light on this, and I think that that would be it's warranted by the facts, and I think the politics of it is interesting because I think the way to deal with the ethics reforms are boring, but if you
yes,
personalize it and make it about Clarence Thomas, think about it this way. Sometimes having been in the Republican Party for years, I sometimes play a little thought experiment about what would they do to exploit vulnerabilities of their opponents. So let's say we had a Democrat Clarence Thomas. What would Mitch McConnell and others do? I mean, there would be impeachment hearings already going on.
24/7.
Absolutely.
Fox would be running stories about it every 10 minutes.
Exactly. And so I think you could do a very good public education with an impeachment inquiry. Yes.
Yeah, I think that would be valuable. I mean, and look, folks, people think that we've never removed anybody from the Supreme Court, but I mean, I was a kid, but in my lifetime, Abe Fortas left the Supreme Court over corruption that was 1/10, 1/100th of what Thomas has on the deck right now.
Oh, absolutely. And that was a time when I guess there was a thing called shame, and did the right
Not
thing.
anymore.
Thomas is shameless, that's for sure.
Yep. So as you mentioned earlier, Thomas is getting up there. He's in his 70s now. In some ways, I feel like the anger he has held with him his entire career on the bench, his entire time in the court, is keeping him there at this point. I think more and more it feels less like jurisprudence and more like, a middle finger, more like fuck you, you can't get rid of me. I just find that the anger in this guy, and look, Clarence Thomas is not a dumb man. He is a smart guy. He has an intellectual framework in his head. But if it just strikes me over and over again, just how not just the Anita Hill hearings, but something else has made this guy so just furious all the time. And I can't understand it.
Yeah, well, he's definitely angry about Anita Hill, but before that, he was as a Black conservative, he was a lightning rod, and he took a lot of positions contrary to the civil rights movement on affirmative action, particularly, and so he's always seen himself, I think, as a victim of a powerful liberal conspiracy, if you will, to undermine him. And so, and that goes back a long time. It even goes back to the fact that he benefited from affirmative action in his own life, and then came out so strongly as an opponent to it. I think that angers him too in a certain way. So he's just a ball of anger. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, he's just I mean, look, we've both known people in our lives who who just hold a lot of anger, and you can see how it manifests in them. And he is the angriest person I've ever seen, whose life has been a pretty smooth upward arc for a very long time. I mean, how you hold on to that much anger after 40 years, after winning the battles of your life that puts you in the most elite circle of judicial power in the world, and you're still mad about it. It blows my mind. So
Yeah, it is hard to imagine, but I think that is the truth.
yeah. So David, what's the key lesson you want people to take away from this book?
Well, I think the key lesson for most voters is to pay attention to what's going on with the court, because, we talked a lot about Roe, but there are issues like separation of church and state, about gun violence,
Sure.
and about corporate power, the ability of various agencies like the EPA to regulate companies to keep the water and air clean. There are a whole host of issues where the Supreme Court really does matter a whole lot, and more than I think most voters think about. And so the key lesson I would say is, like, look at this, and if you are not happy with the current direction of the court, you've got to vote for Kamala Harris.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, David, for coming on the show today. Folks, the book is Stench by David Brock, The Making of the Thomas Court and the Unmaking of America. It is a very cautionary tale about the power of one man to reshape the destiny of the country in a way that has been been controversial and divisive, and about the corruption that is so evident, but it has allowed him to stay on that court just because, as David said in the beginning of the interview, shame is a thing of the past. So thank you again, David, and we will talk to you again soon.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
Look, I know, like, kicking J.D. Vance when he's down is pretty easy because he's a soft, squishy target, like a slow-moving animal or a couch. But J.D. Vance is continuing to tell the lies about Haitians eating cats and dogs in Ohio. The escalation of the danger to the people there has continued. He kept up with it all last week. He did it most of the week before. And in the wake of all this, he's been told now over and over again, it's not true. He's produced, a supposed police report. Turned out the police report was not about a missing cat. It wasn't true. But he also gave away the game, where he said, I'm doing this because I want to make sure we keep immigration in the news. Well, actually, JD, what you're not doing is keeping immigration in the news. What you are doing is causing death threats to be called in, bomb threats to be called in, families to be disrupted, people to be threatened in public, folks being fired from their jobs because they're cat eaters and they're not. And JD, look, you were already written yourself out of the narrative you wanted to be in. You're never going back to Aspen Ideas. You're never going to give a TED Talk again. You're never going to do the things that the elite that welcomed you with open arms when you wrote Hillbilly Elegy, opened doors for you to do. Now it's Hillbilly Eulogy. Your political career is over if he loses. And even if he does lose, you're not running again. You're not the guy. Even your billionaire sponsors, even the people that keep you like a house pet in Silicon Valley, they know you're a loser too. So if you really want to get to the point, JD, where you have some tiny little marginal semblance of dignity and honor, you can stop telling these lies, and you can admit that you told them. You can just say it. Tell the truth, JD, that you lied. You lied because you wanted to inflame racial tensions, and you need those to win. And you're on the enemy's list.